I read a story the other day about a little girl and prayer. She's about 8 years old and an avid bird watcher in training. She spent all her coins on birdseed and would go out to the back porch and fling birdseed all over the porch and then count all the birds that came. She had her little list and she'd check off the chickadees and the wrens and the grackles and the cardinals and just delight in all the birds that came. But while she was content to just watch the birds, her brothers set up traps on the porch and around the house to try to catch them. So the little girl is at school and she's telling her teacher about her brother's traps. And she tells her teacher, "I prayed to God that he wouldn't catch any birds." And the teacher asked the girl, "Did God answer your prayer?" And the girl told her back, "Yes, oh yes, God did. As soon as I finished praying, I went out and kicked the traps to pieces." If only this was how we prayed. This is prayer with such authority and clarity that it inspires action with determination and courage. This simple story about a little girl praying for animals and kicking traps to pieces feels like a parable Jesus would tell. But instead, Jesus told this story. In a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about people. And there was also a widow in that town who kept coming to the judge every day with the same concern: "Grant me justice, for my rights are being denied." For some time the judge refused, but finally the judge said to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or care about people, if only to get this widow to keep bothering me, I will grant her request and see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually wear me down with her coming." The parable of the persistent widow appears only in Luke. And Luke tells us it's a parable about prayer, which is really confusing and a little bit frustrating because the story seems to have nothing to do with prayer. It seems to be about a widow taking her life into her own hands and demanding justice from a judge. It doesn't seem to be about prayer, or at least prayer in the ways I'm used to thinking about it. And maybe that's why I've heard this story misinterpreted 100 times. Too often I've heard this parable as a lesson in wearing God down. God is like this powerful, sometimes cruel judge who is busy doing other important things like keeping the cosmos from imploding or being sucked down into a black hole or something. And we are like the widow, and our suffering is just too minuscule to register in the grand scheme of things. But if we never give up and never stop praying, we can wear God down and God will answer our prayers. I talked to my mom yesterday, and she asked me what text I was preaching. When I told her I was preaching about the parable of the persistent widow, she said, that text that talks about God as this cruel, distant judge, that parable just makes me feel bad, like it's my fault that bad things are happening, like I'm not praying enough and I need to have more faith. I see two major problems with this dominant interpretation. The first problem is that the understanding of God as a judge lets us humans off the hook. It assumes that the widow is powerless, and associating ourselves with the widow, we too are then powerless. All the responsibility for change and justice is then placed exclusively in God's hands, letting us sit back passively. With this interpretation of prayer, we are the ones left helpless and powerless and desperately dependent on a largely dismissive God. And that's the second problem with the dominant interpretation of God as the judge. It makes God look like us, look harsh and distant, impatient and selfish. It makes God look like the unjust, unkind judge who neglects the authority and duty to adjudicate justice. It makes God look deaf to the cries of suffering, thinking them as interruptions and annoyances in God's busy and important work. I do not believe that's what Jesus meant when he told this short story. And I think there's another way to read this parable, a truer way. Jesus and his audience in first century Israel-Palestine are reading the Hebrew scriptures to help them understand God in prayer. And two of the most important figures in the Hebrew Scriptures are Abraham and Jacob, two men who are famous for wrestling with God and for wearing God down until God changed God's mind and answered their prayers. So those are the categories and the views of God in prayer that Jesus and his audience inherited and that they're working with. And that's precisely the view of prayer and God that Jesus is trying to change. Jesus' parable and all his teachings show that God is not the judge you have to wear down. In fact, God is not like a judge at all. And God is not one of the characters in this story. The second verse says that the judge neither feared God nor cared for people. From his very first words, Jesus sets up a clear distinction between the judge and God. The judge doesn't fear God, meaning he's human. He's one of us, and he's nothing like God. Jesus' entire ministry instead reconfigures God as a loving, faithful parent, a motherly father, a fatherly mother, a God whose core identity is love and who sees us as sons and daughters. God is nothing like this judge. The judge has no fear of God, meaning he has no sense of accountability for his actions. And he cares nothing for people, meaning that he sees the widow's suffering as an irritating interruption from his important life. The judge has a self-defined and self-interested view of justice. And he occupies the exact opposite end of the spectrum as the poor widow who comes to him for help. Throughout the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament, widows are used as the paradigmatic oppressed person. As a widow, she's lost not only the love of her life, but also her economic support. In Jesus' time, she cannot inherit her deceased husband's estate. And if she has no adult sons, then she has no one to protect, support, or defend her. And we don't know why she's coming to the judge for help. Maybe it's physical, financial, or emotional. But whatever it is, this widow needs help. Now I want to be very clear right here in saying this. The widow needs help, but she is not powerless. Another false interpretation may be to think that the widow is helpless and powerless, but that's the old interpretation. A closer look at this story reveals a woman who is wily and tenacious, a woman who takes matters into her own hands. Perhaps she stays awake all night long, praying to God for help, pleading with God for justice, begging God for provision. But in the morning, her prayers rouse her actions as she goes every day, standing up, head on, facing this judge and demanding justice. This woman has power, the power of her own sheer determination and persistence, the power that lets no one get in her way, the power that takes responsibility for changing her own circumstances. Applying this parable to us, Jesus is giving a lesson in contrast. God is not the cruel judge, and we are not powerless widows. God is more like a loving, listening parent, and you are more like sons and daughters. You have power to change things. The misinterpretation, then, is thinking that this is a parable about God, for it is not. This is a parable about us. How are we like the cruel judge? Have we been deaf to the cries of suffering and hurting? Are we so caught up in our own busy lives that we miss the chance to help someone in need? Have we gotten too used to the homeless, to the sick, to the imprisoned, to the grieving among us, that we don't even see them anymore? Has the suffering of the world become an interruption and an irritation in our own busy lives? This parable is an invitation to wake up, to pay attention, to become aware, to do better. How are we also like the determined widow? Is it our turn to take heart and take matters into our own hands? Our turn to pray every night and then wake up every morning and do all we can to make our prayers go a little further with some prayerful action? This is a parable about prayer, because the widow becomes the answer to the prayers she has been praying. What have you been praying for? Who have you been praying for? Maybe God is waiting on you to be the answer to the prayers you've been praying. Now, I know some things we cannot change, and it is good to pray about the things that are outside of our control. That's why the serenity prayer is so meaningful to us. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, but also give me the courage to change the things I can. Most of the things that Jesus told us to pray about are things that we can change. Things like daily bread and forgiveness. They are prayers that resolve when we take responsibility for them as individuals in a community. Godly change happens when we step up. And our prayers propel our actions. Propel our prayers, propel our actions. Propel our prayers, propel our actions. A cycle of prayer and action. And Jesus himself embodied this cycle. Before and after Jesus' every moment is prayerful alone time. He retreats to a solitary place to pray, and then he heals the sick. He leaves early in the morning while it's still dark to pray, and then he preaches love and light. He finds a quiet and lonely place to pray, and then he moves through the city with powerful prophetic acts of justice, just like the widow. Our prayer is true and unceasing when it compels action. Jesus ends this parable with a question. When the Son of Humanity comes again, will he find faith on the earth? If faith here is represented by the actions of the widow, then faith means persistent hope and prophetic action. Faith means putting feet to your prayers. Faith means praying for justice by night and demanding it by day. Faith means letting your prayers nourish and inspire your actions. No one is too young or too old for this. I think about the story of 14-year-old Julia Bloom. Julia was sick and tired of seeing shallow and unrealistic depictions of women in media. So she wrote a protest on change.org, a protest demanding that marketing agencies and magazines and toy companies start changing the way they picture women, using less Photoshop and using more images of real girls like her. And 17 magazine responded. Their very next issue, 17 magazine published a body peace treaty in which they promised to use Photoshop only to edit minor details like flyaway hairs or background images, but never to alter a model's appearance, like whiten her teeth or smooth her hair or make her skinnier. They pledged a body peace treaty. And this all happened from the actions of a 14-year-old girl. 14. It's about Lewis's age, right? Lewis is young. No one is too young or too old for this. But indeed, it is not enough that we pray unless we are also willing to act. Unless, like the widow, we are willing to be the answer to the prayers we've been praying. Personally, I'm learning this lesson from my dad and my neighbor, Debbie. Debbie is a recent widow herself. She lost her husband a few years ago, and her children have grown up, and now the house is empty. Well, the other day, Debbie and my dad were walking around the neighborhood and talking, and soon the conversation turned to current events, and they started talking about the Syrian refugee crisis. The UN recently named the Syrian refugee crisis as the world's largest catastrophe. 12.2 million people have fled a reality of violence and death in order to find safety. And over 5.6 million of those people are children, many of whom have been orphaned and deeply traumatized by this violence. The more Debbie and my dad started talking about this, the more they realized that it is no longer enough for them to just pray. It is not enough to stay in oversized homes with overstocked pantries and just pray. Together they decided that to really follow Christ, their prayers must materialize as actions. So my dad called me the other day. He said, "Keith, I need you to start praying about something." This week, Debbie and I are going to talk to the family and talk to our street about adopting a Syrian family. I know it's a lot of work, and I know Mom's sick, but Debbie has the room in our home, and if we all pitch in together, we can do this. We can give a family a new start. We can help a family start over and have a home again. Because it is not enough to pray unless we are also willing to act. Unless, like the widow, we are willing to take matters into our own hands and be the answer to the prayers we've been praying. I'm learning this lesson from my dad, but he learned it from his mama, who we all call Nanny. Now, Dad tells this story something like this. When I was a little boy, one of the families in our church, the Smiths, lost a son in a car accident. And so that Sunday, the whole church gathered and lifted up the Smith family in prayer, praying that they find comfort and peace, praying that they know they're not alone, but that God is with them during this tragic time of loss. Later that afternoon, after church, I was playing a game in the living room when I started smelling Nanny's brownies. Now, Nanny is famous for her brownies. She shaves off big chunks of chocolate, like a pure chocolate bar, and cooks them at a very low heat for a long time so the chocolate doesn't fully melt. They're the best brownies you will ever have. And that day I started smelling them and getting excited. So I burst into the kitchen, all excited, mouth watering, stomach rumbling, and said, "Nanny, I'm ready for my brownies." Nanny looked down at me and she said, "No, baby, these brownies aren't for you. These are for the Smiths. Because prayer goes a little further with some brownies." Indeed, it is not enough to pray unless we are also willing to act. Unless, like the widow, we are willing to become the answer to the prayers we've been praying. What are you praying for? Who are you praying for? Maybe God is waiting to do something magnificent through your action. Maybe it's time to get off your knees, to leave the quiet prayer closet, and to recognize your own power, to go into the streets, to maybe even bake something. Because prayer goes a little further with some action. Or as my nanny would say, prayer goes further with some brownies.
Keith asked me if I would sing this song. I said, "Is there anything that you'd like to hear after the sermon?" He said, "Yes, can you sing We Are the World?" And I thought, really? I first heard this song when I was about 10 years old, and many of you will remember this song. And it was written in response to World Aid and wanting to help hungry people around the world. Shortly after this, there was the Hands Across America. Anyone remember that? Where we kind of made this human chain all the way across the country. And I remember wanting to go to that at 10 years old and asking my parents, and they didn't want me to go because it was organized, it was a secular thing, and we were raised in a really traditional church. But eventually they acquiesced and let me be a part of that. There were two things that came from that really stick with me, and it's really impactful for this song as well, that I was so shocked that no one else from my church was there. Because I realized that we had just prayed about that morning, and Hands Across America was on a Sunday. And then the second thing, I was naive at 10, and I woke up the next day thinking that the world was going to be different, and it wasn't. And so Keith's sermon this morning to help us, to charge us to go into the world is, hope that you will hear that message in this song.
Certain call when the world must come together.